Okay, so we're gonna talk about kelp forests finally, right? So the kelp forest ecosystem, this is basically what we have on, this is what we have on the west coast of the United States. If you're going from the intertidal zone and you just keep going past the subtidal zone, and you're just gonna hit the kelp forest, right? So the kelp forest ecosystem is what we have here on the west coast, right? We can actually, use the conditions of the west coast to try to figure out where all the other kelp forests are located around the world. So let's try to figure that one out. Okay, so let's just draw over here a little picture of the U.S., right? Okay, so we have a kelp forest right over here. Okay, so you see the kelp forest right over here. What kind of water do we have around this area? If you guys remember, the North Pacific Gyre goes like that. Okay, the California current runs from the north to the south, bringing in cold water from Alaska. So we have cold water here, and therefore we can see that kelp forests apparently prefer to live in cold water. So if this is the case, then we can use this to predict where all the other kelp forests are around the world. Okay, so let's just draw the rest of the world real quick. Okay, so Africa. Okay, Europe is right over here. Okay, and there's Australia. All right, so let's take a look at this. Cold water here, kelp forest there. Is there a kelp forest on this side? No. The Gulf Stream brings up warm water from the tropics, and so therefore that place remains to be probably coral reef instead, because warm water, right? Okay. On the other side though, Canary Current, right? The Canary Current brings in cold water from the poles, so yes, along the coast of Europe, we have a kelp forest. Okay. Over here, coast of Asia, no. Kuroshio Current brings up warm water from the tropics. That part is warm. Okay, so there we go. We have kelp forests along here and here on the northern hemisphere. We can do the same thing on the southern hemisphere. We don't know the names of the currents on the southern hemisphere, but we do know how the currents work, and judging by the Coriolis effect, whether the water is warm or cold, right? So over here on the west coast of South America, we have something called the Peru Current, moving water towards the north, and that's cold because it's coming from Antarctica, South Pole, right? So therefore, got some kelp forest right over there. East coast of South America, no, warm water coming down from tropics. How about Africa? Yes, probably kelp forest over there. Cold water from the poles, and over here in Indian Ocean, same thing, no over here, but on here, the west coast of Australia, we have cold water coming up, therefore we have kelp forests. Okay? Alright, and the interesting thing is, on the other side, it's warm water. We do not have a kelp forest. In fact, we have a coral reef, and it is known as the Great Barrier Reef. Okay, so there we have it. We have all the different kelp forests around the world. They are located in those regions because they like to live close to the continent, shallow water, cold water, carried by the currents, right? Okay, so let's continue on and talk about kelp forests, coral reefs. What do they have to do with each other? It turns out both of these are what's known as a reef ecosystem. And I'll get into what that means later, right? So kelp forest, right? Macrocystis pyrifera. This is the giant kelp, right? Cyst, big cyst, right? Macro means big, cyst is a little bubble, right? A bubble of air. You guys can see them right here. What do you guys think these are used for? Right, probably to float up to the surface. Why would it need to float up to the surface? Because that's how it gets the sunlight, right? If you guys remember from the old primary production lectures, kelp is brown algae, phaeophyta. Okay, so giant kelp, probably the most common one, and another one that we have is the bull kelp, Nereocystis luetkeana, something like that, I'm not really sure. But here you see the cyst, and Nereo, I think it means worm, so kind of long like a worm, not really sure. But yeah, bull kelp, if you have a bunch of these kelps together, then you get a kelp forest, right? What do all kelp need? Well, it's a macroalgae, so they like their hard substrate, right? Here we have the hard substrate, a rocky hard substrate, where you see some grazers here. We all know sirens like to eat kelp, okay? Hard substrate. Well, that's the thing. This hard substrate, this rocky substrate, is considered a reef, right? Not the normal reef that you think of, but this is still considered a reef. Why? Because anything that is rocky and has holes in it for fish to hide in is a reef, okay? So like when I first normally mention reef, what do you guys think of? Coral reef, probably? But not all not all reefs are made out of coral. A reef could be anything that's rocky and has those holes. So let's just check on this one. Is this rocky? Well, it's coral made of calcium carbonate. Seashells, yes, right? It's hard, it's rocky. Does it have holes in it? Sure, right? Anything with those nooks and crannies is considered a reef. This one's made out of coral, it's a coral reef. Take a look at this. This is a break wall in Monterey Bay. Is this a reef? Is it rocky? Well, those are rocks, for sure. Does it have holes in it? Yes, this is a reef, okay? It may not be as pretty, but this is considered a reef, and this is kind of like the reef that the kelp forest grows upon. So, as you guys can see here, we have the rocky substrate at the bottom, all that structure, it's rocky, has holes in it, that is considered a reef. Doesn't have to be made out of coral, right? So this is a reef ecosystem with a kelp canopy at the top. Kelp is cool because it also provides shelter and food for the organisms in addition to the rocky substrate beneath. This is a picture of the kelp forest over here in California, so maybe you guys can recognize some things. Anybody know any of these fish? This one maybe? This orange one is our California state fish. It's called the Garibaldi, right? I think it's just because all golden things, we kind of like to make our state things, like the poppy, you know, gold was discovered in California, why not? So, there we go. Okay, so kelp forest, right? Besides Garibaldi, let's take a look at what else lives inside the coral reef, right? So we can start with this picture of a coral reef. Here's the canopy, and keep in mind, it provides it provides habitat, shelter, and food for many of the inhabitants, right? What might the inhabitants be? Well, since it's kelp, we might have a kelp crab, right? Kelp crab is a grazer of kelp, but not only that, we have other things that eat kelp, such as, over there we got the red abalone and purple sea urchin, right? What else lives in the kelp forest? Fish like the cabezon and sea otters, sea lions, and the killer whale is not really a kelp forest ecosystem or organism, but I'll show you how it's involved in this later, right? So you take all these organisms, if you connect a bunch of arrows between them, what do we have? Food web, right? This is a food web. Keep in mind, a food web is useful because it shows many different interactions. However, it may be somewhat confusing to look at, but nevertheless, this is a pretty standard kelp forest food web, right? Here we see the primary consumers, they are eating the kelp, and so on and so forth. We could take all these organisms and arrange them like this, and there you go. The 5 trophic levels that we usually talk about, we can name off their trophic levels right now, right? So starting from here, primary producers, primary consumers, secondary consumers, tertiary consumers, and quaternary consumers. But if you don't have any natural predators, then you're the apex predator, right? So we can put those names in. Hopefully this is reviewed. This is pretty easy, and this is directly pertaining to the trophic pyramid that we've talked about many times before. Okay, what this says is the killer whale has the least biomass. There's the least amount of killer whales out there, and there's the most amount of kelp. If you weighed all the kelp in this ecosystem, it would weigh more than everything else combined. How much more would the kelp weigh than, say, the primary consumers? 10 times. If you guys remember, the trophic level transfer efficiency says that on average, 10% of the energy makes it across to the next level. So therefore, this part should be 10 times less than this and 10 times more than that, right? Vice versa. Okay, so anyways, let's take a look at this food chain, right? So I changed it to a food chain because the food chain is simpler and it allows us to explain a concept much more easily. Okay, so I want to get into a little thought experiment here, right? So what does this food chain read? Kelp gets eaten by the sea urchin, gets eaten by the sea otter, gets eaten by the killer whale. Sounds simple enough? What would happen if we removed one of these organisms? How about the sea otter? Right? If we remove the sea otter, two immediate things happen. All right? What do you guys think they are? We look above, we can look below. For one of the things that's going to happen is the killer whale is not going to have a food source. So it will probably, well, I mean, some things might starve if they lose the food source, but the killer whale is not dumb. It'll probably migrate. So it's gone now. What will happen to the sea urchins, right? Sea urchins, they just lost their predator. They're not worried anymore. They're gonna be happy, right? They are gonna explode in population. That's exactly what happens. Sea urchins experience prey release when you get rid of sea otters, just like how mussels experience prey release when we take away the sea stars, right? So, quick recap, prey release. If you get rid of the natural predator, then their population will increase because they're no longer limited by that predator, right? And in consequence, these sea urchins are going to start to eat all the kelp. And that's what they do. They eat all the kelp. So there you go. Eat all the kelp. What do we have left? This is called an urchin baron. And they actually exist too. See, like, look at this. Two different species of sea urchins, the purple and the red sea urchin. We got a couple perch here and a sea star, but other than that, nothing else, just sea urchins, right? This used to be a lush kelp forest, but all we have here is just sea urchins, and it looks very barren. We don't have that much biodiversity in this area. Okay, and that's bad. It's not a very healthy ecosystem. So, considering the fact that we just lost so much biodiversity, we might be thinking of something that had to do with biodiversity in the last lecture. Keystone species, perhaps, right? So, let's get into keystone species. These guys, right, we are gonna kind of convert to a little framework just to examine exactly what happened, right? So we kind of started here because the sea otter was actually a secondary consumer, and we can kind of omit the killer whale. So let's just talk about these ones. What do we do with the sea otter? We took it out, all right? So if we took it out, what happens to primary consumers? They will explode in population, experience prey release, right? And then they will eat all the primary producers and get rid of them. This little thing that you start from the top goes all the way down is called a top-down trophic cascade. And it is characterized by this alternating pattern, as you guys can see here, right? So this is negative and this is positive, right? The sea urchins actually benefit from this, and then this is negative. So there's an alternating pattern as you go down the full food chain, right? So top down, starts from the top, goes down. Trophic has something to do with eating and energy, and cascade means waterfall. So it kind of like goes all the way through the whole ecosystem. Okay? So then we get all the way to the very bottom, and at the end we get the urchin baron. We lost a lot of biodiversity, all because we lost that one secondary consumer we had, the sea otter. Right? So maybe we have a hint here that the sea otter was a keystone species, right? So remember, the keystone species is the member of the ecosystem whose existence allows there to be a high biodiversity. Without it, the biodiversity goes down. And so as you guys saw, with the sea otter, there was a lot of life, but if you took out the sea otter, there's only sea urchins left. Biodiversity goes down. So that's bad, right? In this case, the sea otter indeed is the keystone species of the kelp forest. Okay, so by the time we get to the very bottom, maybe it starts to go back up, right? So maybe we have something called, starting from the bottom, a bottom-up trophic cascade, right? So let's just see how that goes. Let's put that framework back. Start from here this time, and go up. So what do we do to the primary producers? Well, the sea urchins ate it all, okay? So no more primary producers left, let's get rid of them. Okay, what's gonna happen to the primary consumers? These guys depend on these for food. There's no more food. So they're gonna starve. Primary consumers starve once there's no more primary producers. And then what happens to secondary consumers? The secondary consumers are gonna starve because there's no more primary consumers to eat. And so on and so forth. Apex predators also starve or they migrate away. So what we have here, the bottom up trophic cascade, is basically a consistent repeating pattern of the same negativity from the bottom all the way to the top. But at the same time, you have to realize, since it's a consistent pattern, they can actually be all good, right? So what happens if we put more primary producers in this area? Then that increases the food source, and now there's more primary consumers because their population goes up when there's more food. If there's more primary consumers, then there's more food for secondary consumers, so their population goes up. And if their population goes up, now there's more food for apex predators, and theirs goes up as well. So you can see it could either be all negative or all positive. The point is, it starts on the bottom, it goes to the top, and it's all the same, right? It's consistent. Okay? It's not alternating. When you go top down, it always alternates, good, bad, but when you go all the way to the top, it's either all bad or it's all good at the same time. In this case, it's all bad, right? Our bottom trophic cascade in the kelp forest was all bad. We can see it right here, right? Let's just check it out. Here is the sea otter. We're gonna get rid of the sea otter, right? All of a sudden, we're gonna experience prey release of the sea urchins. They increase in population, and then they eat up all the kelp. That is our top-down trophic cascade. Once we're at the bottom, it starts to go back up. And when it goes back up, once the kelp is gone, the grazers have no more food to eat. They die in numbers, and then the ones above have no more food, so they're gonna die out, and these ones are gonna die out, so on and so forth, right? And we're left with this, urchin barren. Okay? The biodiversity now is really, really low, and it's all because there's no more sea otters. There's no more sea otters controlling the sea urchin population, and therefore this whole sets in motion this whole crazy trophic cascade. Okay, and we get urchin barren. Okay, now here's the thing. This was the scenario that took place in Northern California and the rest of the northern west coast, so like Oregon, Washington, parts of Canada, right? They have experienced their loss of sea otters, and therefore the sea urchin populations are crazy there, right? When I go diving up in Northern California, the water's a lot colder, but at the same time, you look down and it's just rocks covered in sea urchins and urchin barren. All the kelp that I see is only about like this high, and it's just like the stub of kelp. I don't see any of the blades, right? The leaves of the kelp. Those are all eaten. Sea urchins all over the place. But here in SoCal, there's still really lush kelp forests, right? The kelp is thick, right? Sometimes it gets really hard to crawl through all that. Why is there so much kelp in Southern California, but not so much in Northern California, right? Let's examine the food web of the Southern California kelp forest. It looks kind of like this, right? I switched some of these guys out. We still have purple sea urchins, but as you guys can notice, this time I'm using the southern kelp crab instead of the northern kelp crab. And here's the green abalone instead of the red abalone. Okay? But anyways, we have all these organisms here in Southern California. And what do we notice about the sea urchin this time? The sea urchin last time was being eaten by the sea otters, almost solely. Right? But over here, who do we have eating the sea urchins? We have a fish. That one's called a sheephead. California spiny lobster. And this southern kelp crab. And horn shark, right? Like everybody here is basically feasting off of the sea urchin, keeping their numbers low and making so that they never explode in population and create the urchin barren, right? This is good. This is what's keeping the whole ecosystem healthy here down in SoCal, right? What would happen what would happen if we were to remove one of these predators, right? So for example, we remove sea otters in Northern California and urchins explode in population. So let's do the same thing. Let's remove one of the predators of the sea urchins and let's see what happens. Right? How about spiny lobsters? Right? Let's get rid of all the spiny lobsters. Let's say we overfish them. Right? When we do that, we're going to see that there's going to be an interesting concept at play. Redundancy. Right? Now, redundancy is basically when you have multiple species taking up the same niche, and if one of them goes away, that's okay. The rest of them that are doing the same niche will just pick up the slack, and the ecosystem will stay, relatively stable. Okay, so let's just see how that's going to work. Like I said, let's take away the spiny lobster. We take away the spiny lobster, and yeah, it's gonna not be able to eat the sea urchins anymore. But is the ecosystem gonna collapse? Are we gonna have an urchin barren? Are the sea urchins gonna, exhibit some prey release? No, because even though we don't have any more spiny lobsters eating the sea urchins, we still have sheepheads and horn sharks and southern kelp crabs picking up the slack for the spiny lobster. Right? Now that's a really interesting concept, redundancy, right? We see redundancy going on in Southern California, which is the reason why this ecosystem is still going strong, right? It's a lot more robust. Okay, so let's talk about why that is. Niches, right? Let's imagine we have two ecosystems. I'm going to draw the ecosystem real quick. So this is an ecosystem with the boxes right over here, right? These boxes are representing niches. Okay, so 3 niches. So let's say niche 1, 2, and 3. Ecosystem 1 is like this, and ecosystem 2 has the same 3 niches right over here. Okay, let's just say let's put some animals in them. Okay, we'll put animal species A, B, C, X, Y, Z, and 7. Okay, right. And for this one, let's just put a couple of the same ones and some new ones right here. Okay, I'm just gonna arbitrarily assign niches to all of them, right? This is not like the truth or anything. This is just illustrating the concept. Okay, let's just say that niche 1 is fulfilled by A and X, and let's put C in there too. It doesn't really matter. Okay, how about number 2 is filled with B and K, and we'll put Y and Z in niche number 3. Okay, so for ecosystem number 2, for A has to go here and B has to go there, but I and J doesn't really matter, so we'll just put I over here and J right over there. Okay, so what would happen to these ecosystems if something occurred and A went extinct? Right? If A goes extinct, right? No more A's. A's gone from the earth. We're going to take them out of the ecosystems. Now, which of these ecosystems is still functioning? Right here. Ecosystem 1. It has all of its niches fulfilled. It exhibits redundancy. There are multiple species taking up the same niche, so if we got rid of A, it's okay because X and C are just going to pick up the slack. Right? That ecosystem still functions. All their niches are being fulfilled. There's a balance. But look at ecosystem 2. Without A, nobody's doing niche number 1. This ecosystem will fall apart. Right? When this ecosystem falls apart because you lose that one, what was the cause? They did not have redundancy. Why did they not have redundancy? The only difference between these two ecosystems is the fact that ecosystem 1 had a greater biodiversity than ecosystem 2. So there you have it. Redundancy is more likely to happen if we have a higher biodiversity. And that's one of basically the reasons why scientists advocate for high biodiversity, right? We want more biodiversity because that gives ecosystems more redundancy and it makes ecosystems more robust to changes, right? They're less likely to change. We can get rid of several of the organisms and it should be okay because the other ones will pick up the slack and still do the same niche. Okay? Okay, so anyways, why are we even talking about this, right? Why are we talking about getting rid of sea otters in the first place? Well, it has something to do with us, of course, right? Here's a sea otter. Why are the sea otters declining in population? right? Well, the sea otters are declining in population. Well, the obvious reason is they have those pelts, right? They are being hunted for their fur. That is one reason, for sure. But this is actually not the main reason, right? Overfishing is definitely a really important reason for their decline, but the actual reason has to do with this fish. This is a type of salmon, right? The salmon is found over here in the West Coast, and unfortunately for the salmon, it has a really archaic and backwards reproductive method, right? Its reproductive strategy is really bad, and that's why it's going extinct. It has to go back into the river, the same river that it was born in, and lay its eggs, right? And people like to dam those rivers and extract power from them, and people like to overfish salmon, so they're doomed, right? That's why we like to farm salmon so much. So back in the day, when we hunted all the salmon, right? Hunted all the salmon, overfished the salmon, and then what happens? Well, here's the thing. It turns out that salmon is actually a major player in the food web that we saw earlier, the kelp forest food web, right? Let's put it in the kelp forest food web and see what it does. You guys see it? Right here. Salmon is eaten by the killer whale. Okay, so people like to eat salmon, killer whales like to eat salmon, right? Salmon is a killer whale's preferred food. However, when the people overhunt the salmon, right, overfish the salmon, then the killer whale is like, I don't have any more salmon left to eat, but you know what? It doesn't faze me that much. I have other choices. Sea lions and sea otters. What is this? This is a really interesting and obscure type of redundancy, actually. The niche of being food for the killer whale, basically, right? That's a super interesting thing, right? Redundancy in its diet. So the killer whale is like, okay, if I can't get any more salmon, I'm just going to switch over to sea otters. And that's what it does. Killer whales ramped up their predation on sea otters, and they ate up all the sea otters. When they ate up all the sea otters, gone. Prey release of sea urchins, ate all the kelp. That's our top-down trophic cascade. Once the kelp is gone, it trickles back up. All the grazers die, the secondary consumers die, and so on and so forth. And what are we left with? Urchin barren. Let's do a quick comparison with sea otters, without sea otters, with sea otters, without sea otters. You guys see how sea otters, the existence of them, makes such a big difference in the biodiversity count? That basically shows you that sea otters are a keystone species. Okay, so hopefully that makes sense, right? Sea otter is definitely the keystone species. Its existence allows there to be a high biodiversity. Without it, nobody's controlling the sea otter or the sea urchins, and then the whole ecosystem falls apart. Okay, so I prepared these. This is just like a quick summary of what we talked about. The lecture's not exactly finished from here, but you guys can check this out at home, all right? It's just basically a little summary of everything we just went over. You know how in the food web of the kelp forest, if you get rid of the sea otters, the sea urchins experience prey release, and they increase in population, and then all of a sudden they, excuse me, all of a sudden they eat up all the kelp, and then that's the top-down trophic cascade, and it goes all the way back up. You lose a lot of biodiversity. Shows that sea otters are the keystone species of the kelp forest. Okay. All right. So, anyways, the last thing I want to talk about involves the result, right? The urchin barren, the result. So, walking through this food chain again to illustrate the concept, we got rid of the sea otters, right? And then prey release made it turn into an urchin barren. Urchin barren. Let's compare the urchin barren to the kelp forest from before. This is lush. This is bad, right? Okay? The urchin barren, no good. What's the difference between these two ecosystems? For one, the urchin barren has a lot less biodiversity than before, right? We lost a lot of biodiversity, and then second, we also changed the dominant organism. Dominant organism means the most common organism found there, and in this case, It is the sea urchins. What did it used to be? Kelp. Because as a primary producer, those are basically almost always the dominant organism. So this thing is what's called a regime shift, right? Regime is like a period of rule, because regi means king, and it basically involves a drastic change in biodiversity, namely losing biodiversity, and then the dominant species will change as well, okay? So if the dominant species change and the biodiversity also changes a lot, usually goes down, then we have a regime shift, okay? So usually they're pretty bad, but yeah, regime shift, okay? So when the kelp forest ecosystem turned into an urchin barren, that is an example of a regime shift, and in this case, at the end, we ended up with an urchin barren, right? Okay, so the cause of the regime shift may be biological, caused by other organisms, environmental, like the environment changes, but of course, anthropogenic, which means caused by people. And when we talk about tomorrow, our lecture on coral reefs, we will see the 5 threats to biodiversity that are anthropogenic, right? The 5 anthropogenic threats to biodiversity, okay? And it becomes a really interesting discussion because throughout this whole lecture, we kind of vilified the sea urchin because the sea urchin ate up all the kelp and it kind of ruined the ecosystem, right? But here's the thing. The sea urchin is only bad if the kelp or whatever it eats is good. So depending on the role of algae in the environment, we'll be able to tell if sea urchins are actually bad or not. So in this case, they definitely seem like they're the bad guys. But as we're going to see tomorrow, sea urchins can also be good. So that's pretty interesting, right? We're going to see tomorrow when we talk about coral reefs, the role that sea urchins play in the coral reef, the sea urchin's niche in the coral reef. Right? Okay, cool. So that's the end of this lecture on coral reef ecology. We didn't talk kelp forest ecology. We didn't talk too much about the kelp forest, but it is really important and interesting to take a look at the trophic interactions of the food web, and especially how the sea otter and the lack of sea otters affects the whole ecosystem completely. Okay. All right, any questions? Okay, I think we're good.